Christian Idealism, and today we're just going to be trying to understand free will from a neuroscientific perspective. This is, of course, brought to you by Cal Allender. So first, before we get into free will, we need to first recap and move forward beyond this point. In the last video, we went over the Leibniz experiments, and we explained the problems with an argument against free will based on these experiments. Of course, the biggest problem with the Leibniz type arguments against free will was due to the fact that in the experiments, they were testing people's arbitrary rather than deliberate choices. In 2018, Mayo's study confirmed that there is a lack of readiness potential in the brain during deliberate decision-making, thereby refuting the main arguments against libertarian free will. And so in this video, I just want to highlight some important discoveries in recent neuroscience that do give more weight towards libertarian free will over determinism. So first, we need to understand how exactly the brain works, because I think once we understand this, then we can kind of move forward and understand how it's conceivable that you could have libertarian free will in a deterministic universe. So first, the brain does not use logic in a deterministic sense. It is non-linear in the sense of being able to shift direction, and it is definitely not like a computer that runs on linear processes. While there is an autopilot to the brain, which is, of course, the readiness potential, there is no evidence that it controls free will in deliberate choices, since in deliberate choices there are different non-linear mechanisms that drive free will in this type of process. And so deliberate choices are more important, and so free will is more involved when dealing with moral decisions or decisions that have bigger impacts on life. The brain does not use circuits in decision making, and neurons act in a non-linear way and can rewire themselves in whatever the agent makes themselves to be. And so this is nothing like our modern day computers or even quantum computer systems. So I also want to highlight the fact that there is about a 200 to 300 millisecond buffering between when someone makes a choice and them feeling themselves they made that choice. In other words, the brain is always predicting the future of what would occur, and it kind of explains why more commonly than not we react to danger in quick ways, as if our brains can predict the future. Well, the same process for predicting the future in that way also works for decision making. And so I'm going to go over just two models of free will. So first is Peter Tyson's model. Under his model, the neurons in the brain are self-selective. They are not determined or random. Rather, these neurons go through what is set up by the brain's previous decisions. And so he kind of divides this into like type 1 free will and type 2. So type 1 free will is basically just someone making a choice on a daily basis. And so it's basically just neurons self-selecting to make an overall choice. However, type 2 free will is what he calls meta free will, and it is the person that was built up through their life, and it is the criteria that needs to be met in order for type 1 free will to take place. And so this is kind of how he explains type 1 free will. He says that free will has a 3-stage model, and so he says the first stage is when neurons are processing information, they set new information criteria which subsequent inputs must meet to trigger firing. Then the second stage would be inputs arriving at a later time, are variable reflecting a randomness that Tyson argues is often ontological. And then, of course, the third stage is when these inputs arrive at a neuron at the later time, they either meet the previous set of criteria or they don't. And so this kind of determines whether or not the neuron will fire or not. And so again, just to kind of simplify here, what he's saying is you have these self-selective neurons in type 1, but then those self-selective neurons have to meet a criteria that was already built from type 2 free will, which of course develops over time and is not just, it's not just one choice, but it's multiple choices put together. And so that's kind of his model. Then the second model is from Rabinovsky. This model is still in the works, but it has a central questioner that is aware of its environment, and neurons can act in both deterministically and indeterministically depending on the subject's actions. So again, if someone is making a choice as to go to a party, it is not as life-threatening as something as important as to whether you're going to save someone's life or not. there are different neurological mechanisms underlying decision making based on what that decision is about. And so there seems to be a hierarchy of how much control the readiness potential will have and how much the intentional mind will have. And so again, more research is needed in this model, but this model goes over why the brain is like a single organ but has many different systems working, and each system has its own hierarchy and so forth. So the thing to remember here is that one's metaphysical beliefs will have an impact on how they see decision making. Materialist, dualist, and idealist models of decision making will all be somewhat different. Free will is just getting studied in neuroscience, and our understanding of the brain needs to mature more before we actually have an official model. Again, the models I just went over, they are not reality, okay? They're just models. That doesn't mean that they are actual reality. But they actually, I think they do help us to discover what the reality is free will is. So whether or not they're the correct model, I think it's important that there are actual models out there that do somewhat, at least explain partially how free will can work. And so again, further research is definitely needed in this field. And so to summarize, we realize that all the evidence against free will relies on incomplete understanding of neuroscience. With new research in place, we know that free will is in the brain, but explaining it still needs more research. So while models will pop up here and there, we cannot move forward in neuroscience until free will skepticism is abandoned. And so that hopefully in the far future we could actually come up with a decent model that explains the evidence and that can actually explain free will. And so again, neuroscience is a complicated subject. And to make it investigate free will, I think, will take many more years of research. But for now, we can clearly see that it is at least conceivable for there to be an actual neurological explanation of free will. So regardless of our metaphysical beliefs, we can be confident that free will is very much correlated with the brain, and that that neuroscience will hopefully one day be able to actually explain free will. And so while we may not have a complete explanation of free will, there are decent models that give us clues, and so it's clear that we very much do indeed possess free will, but we just don't yet know exactly how it works in its relation to the brain. And so that will pretty much be all I have to say here. Thank you for watching. All sources are in the description, and have a nice day.